My father spotted me limping down the street with my baby shivering in my arms. "Where is your car?" he demanded over the heavy thunder. I whispered that my mother-in-law took the keys to teach me a lesson. He threw his truck door open and said, "Get in because nobody treats my daughter like that." At exactly 9 tonight, her elite world would collapse. My name is Brianna, 30 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed I had to endure financial abuse to keep my family together. As a freelance designer, I was used to solving complex problems, but I could not design a way out of my toxic marriage to Derek. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to escape a manipulative mother-in-law who tried to control your existence. My father Thomas raised me to stand on my own 2 feet, but love blinds you. When I married Derek, a corporate sales director with a charming smile, I thought I was stepping into a true partnership. Instead, I was stepping into a carefully constructed trap managed entirely by his mother, Patricia. Patricia, a wealthy 61-year-old socialite, ruled her affluent Atlanta suburb with a platinum credit card, using her wealth to keep Derek firmly attached to her apron strings. That afternoon, a massive summer thunderstorm threatened Atlanta. I limped down the paved sidewalks of Patricia's elite gated community. Every step sent white-hot agony shooting up my right leg. I had severely sprained my ankle slipping on the polished hardwood stairs at her mansion. When it happened, Derek barely looked up from his sports broadcast. Patricia had simply stepped over me, clicking her tongue and muttering about how clumsy I always was. They refused to take me to urgent care, claiming they were too busy preparing for a country club dinner. Hours later, I dragged my injured foot across the concrete, clutching my 8-month-old son, Leo. Heavy rain began to fall, soaking my blouse. Leo whimpered against my shoulder, sensing the sudden chill. I shielded his small body from the wind, my arms burning. The excruciating pain in my ankle made me stumble with every movement. I felt entirely humiliated, surrounded by multi-million-dollar mansions, while I limped like a beggar in the rain. A horn blared behind me. I flinched, turning to see a familiar dark green pickup truck screech to a halt against the curb. My father jumped out his boots, splashing into a puddle. Years working for the Internal Revenue Service gave Thomas a sharp, analytical gaze that missed nothing. Right now it was fixed on my swollen ankle and tear-stained face. "Brianna, what on earth is going on?" he shouted over the rising wind. He hurried over and gently took Leo from my exhausted arms, tucking him inside his jacket. "Where is your car? Why are you walking in a storm with a sprained ankle?" I leaned against the side of his truck, defeated. "I do not have a car, Dad." "What do you mean you do not have a car?" he demanded, his brow furrowing. "Derek and Patricia gave you that luxury SUV when Leo was born. Everyone saw them hand you the keys at the baby shower." Fresh tears mixed with the rain on my cheeks. "It was a prop, Dad. A prop for her social media photos. Patricia never put the title in my name. She kept the registration and the spare key. This morning, after I fell, I realized we were completely out of formula and diapers for Leo. Derek refused to go to the store, so I used the emergency credit card to buy $50 worth of baby supplies online." My father's eyes darkened. "And what did Patricia do? She got the alert on her phone?" I sobbed. "She marched into the kitchen, backed me into a corner, and snatched the car keys right out of my hand. She declared that until I asked permission before spending her money, I was grounded. She said she needed to teach me a lesson about respect. I begged Derek to say something to defend me, but he just stood there. He told me I needed to learn how to respect the family hierarchy." Thomas stood perfectly still in the pouring rain. His jaw clenched tightly. He was radiating a quiet, dangerous fury. The kind of anger that did not scream or throw things, but dismantled empires brick by brick. He carefully settled Leo into the car seat in the back of the truck, ensuring he was warm and secure. He opened the passenger door for me. "Get in," he said calmly. "You and Leo are coming home with me. Nobody treats my daughter like a prisoner. Nobody takes away your ability to care for your child." I climbed into the heated cabin of the truck, shivering uncontrollably. My father slid into the driver's seat and glared at Patricia's massive estate in the rearview mirror. His hands gripped the steering wheel with intense focus. For 3 years, they diminished my career, isolated me, and controlled my finances. I thought keeping the peace was better for my baby. I believed working harder and agreeing to their terms would make them accept me. As the truck sped away, the throbbing pain in my ankle served as a harsh reality check. They did not want an equal. They wanted a subordinate. They think they hold all the power because they control the accounts, my father said quietly. But arrogant people always make careless mistakes. Tonight we are going to start looking into exactly how Patricia funds that lavish lifestyle. I leaned my head against the window, watching the rain blur the streetlights. The scared wife who limped down that pavement was washed away by the storm. In her place was a woman ready to reclaim her life. The heater in Thomas's truck roared, fighting the damp chill in my bones. Rain lashed against the windshield. I watched the rhythmic sweeping of the wipers, trying to ground myself, while Leo drifted into a fitful sleep in his car seat. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. The silence was heavy, charged with the electricity that precedes a strike. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Finally, he broke the silence. He asked me how long Patricia had held the title to the vehicle. I took a shaky breath, my ankle throbbing with my pulse. I told him it had been that way from the beginning. At my baby shower, Patricia made a massive spectacle of presenting a velvet box containing keys to a luxury SUV. She announced to 50 friends that the mother of her first grandson deserved to drive in absolute safety. Everyone clapped loudly. Everyone thought she was generous. I wiped cold rain from my cheek. She never actually filed the transfer paperwork. Every time I brought it up, she claimed her accountant needed to review the tax implications, or that she was simply too busy running the country club board. I was naive. I thought it was just a bureaucratic delay. I did not realize it was a leash. She kept the title in her name so she could revoke my transportation the second I stepped out of line. Buying $50 worth of diapers with her precious emergency credit card was my breaking point. Thomas signaled a lane change, his jaw set like granite. He asked the question I had been dreading. He asked where my husband was when his mother cornered me in the kitchen. I closed my eyes, picturing the morning's events with sickening clarity. Derek was standing right there, leaning against the marble kitchen island. He was holding a cup of espresso, perfectly dressed in his tailored suit for his corporate sales director job. I told my father exactly what happened. I told him how I looked at Derek, pleading with him to intervene. My ankle was swelling to the size of a baseball, and I could barely put weight on my right foot. I asked Derek to tell his mother we needed the car, that Leo needed his formula and a dry set of clothes. Instead of defending his wife, Derek took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked at me with cold, detached eyes and said I had overstepped my bounds. He actually told me I needed to learn to respect the family hierarchy. He said his mother was the matriarch, and if I wanted the privileges of the family wealth, I had to play by her rules. Then he simply set his espresso cup down, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the door to his office, leaving me stranded with a crying infant and a confiscated set of keys. The absolute betrayal of watching the man I married side with his controlling mother over the safety of his own child crushed whatever remaining love I had for him. My father let out a low, guttural breath. "A husband is supposed to be a shield," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "not a bystander." We approached a familiar intersection, and I suddenly realized we were not heading toward the downtown hospital. Thomas had bypassed the exit for the urgent care clinic completely. Panic flared briefly in my chest. I asked him where we were going. My ankle needed ice and a medical professional. Thomas did not look at me. He just kept his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. "We are going to address the root of the infection before we treat the symptom," he replied. The truck turned onto a pristine tree-lined avenue that I knew all too well. We were driving right back into the lion's den. At exactly 9 o'clock at night, Thomas pulled his heavy mud-splattered pickup truck up to the wrought iron gates of Patricia's sprawling estate. He did not bother waiting for security clearance. He simply reached out the window and keyed in the emergency family passcode I had shared with him months ago. The heavy iron gates swung wide open, granting us access to the massive circular driveway. The storm was still raging outside, but Patricia's mansion was a beacon of warm golden light. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling dining room windows, the scene inside was perfectly illuminated like a stage play. I stared through the rain-slicked glass of the truck, feeling my stomach twist into a painful knot. There they were, Patricia and Derek. They were sitting at the long mahogany dining table enjoying a lavish catered meal. Patricia was laughing, her head thrown back, holding a crystal glass of red wine. Derek was smiling, cutting into a thick steak, looking completely relaxed and unbothered. They were carrying on with an elegant evening, casually dining, while my son and I were supposed to be wandering the streets in a severe thunderstorm. My husband did not look worried. He did not look like a man wondering if his injured wife and infant son had found shelter from the heavy rain. He looked relieved that the inconvenience had been removed from his house. Thomas turned off the ignition. The sudden silence in the truck cab was deafening, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain against the roof. He unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to look at me. The protective fury in my father's eyes gave me a sudden, unexpected surge of strength. "Lock the doors and stay here with Leo," Thomas instructed, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am going to have a word with your husband." He opened the door and stepped out into the pouring rain, marching up the stone steps toward the grand mahogany front doors without an ounce of hesitation. This brutal confrontation I had feared for years was finally happening with absolutely no turning back. My father did not bother searching for the doorbell or reaching for the heavy brass knocker. He simply lifted his heavy work boot and delivered a violent, bone-shattering kick directly to the center latch of the double mahogany front doors. The sheer force of the impact ripped the deadbolt right out of the doorframe. The massive wooden doors burst inward with a thunderous crack, slamming violently against the pristine marble walls of the grand foyer. The booming echo reverberated through the entire mansion, instantly silencing the classical music playing softly from the hidden surround sound speakers. Inside the heated truck cabin, I knew I could not sit passively and watch my father fight my battles alone. I checked the back seat to ensure Leo was completely fast asleep and securely strapped in. I locked the truck doors, leaving the engine and heat running to keep him safe, and pulled myself out into the freezing downpour. Every step up the stone pathway sent jagged spikes of agony shooting up my right leg, but pure adrenaline fueled my movements. I dragged my soaked, shivering body up the front steps and reached the grand entryway just as Thomas stepped into the formal dining room. The opulent dining room was a scene of perfect, undisturbed luxury until we shattered it. A massive crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the long table, illuminating the expensive catered meal they were enjoying while I was banished to the storm. Derek dropped his steak knife in shock. It clattered loudly against his fine bone china plate, staining the pristine white tablecloth with a splash of dark gravy. He jumped to his feet so fast, his heavy dining chair scraped harshly against the imported silk rug. For a brief second, he looked terrified, staring wide-eyed at the towering, soaked figure of my furious father standing in his home. But Derek quickly recovered, relying on the slick corporate sales tactics he used to manipulate his clients. He held both of his hands up in the air in a placating defensive gesture. A high, incredibly nervous laugh escaped his throat, echoing awkwardly across the vaulted ceilings. "Thomas, hey, let us all just calm down for a second," Derek stammered, his eyes darting frantically between my father's clenched fists and my soaked figure limping into the doorway behind him. "There is a massive misunderstanding happening here. You do not need to kick my doors in." My father took a slow, deliberate step forward, his wet boots leaving dark, muddy footprints across their immaculate floors. Derek backed up slightly, rubbing the back of his neck and forcing a bright, entirely fake smile onto his face. "Brianna is just being incredibly dramatic." Derek continued, waving his hand in my direction, as if I were a misbehaving toddler. "She is totally hormonal right now. You know how she gets when she is stressed out. She is completely overreacting over borrowing a car. It is my mother's vehicle, Thomas. Brianna just needs to learn how to ask politely instead of throwing a massive tantrum, twisting her ankle, and marching out into the rain like a martyr." Before my father could tear Derek apart for that comment, Patricia decided to intervene. She did not look scared or startled by our violent entrance. She slowly stood up from her plush velvet dining chair, smoothing her hands over the front of her designer evening gown. She reached down, picked up her crystal glass filled with expensive red wine, and gave it a slow, deliberate swirl. She looked right past my father and locked her cold, dead eyes directly onto mine. The absolute contempt radiating from her gaze literally took my breath away. She viewed me as dirt on the bottom of her shoe, an infestation she was finally ready to exterminate. Derek is entirely right, Patricia announced, her voice dripping with venomous condescension that cut through the tension in the room. Your daughter has absolutely no concept of reality, responsibility, or basic gratitude. I stood leaning heavily against the doorframe, my ankle throbbing violently, freezing rain dripping from my tangled hair onto their polished marble floor. We gave her a roof over her head and a beautiful life, Patricia continued, taking a delicate, unbothered sip of her red wine. We did this because heaven knows she could never provide for herself or my grandson. What does she actually do all day? That freelance UX/UI design nonsense. Patricia threw her head back and let out a sharp, genuinely ugly laugh. It is a delusional little computer hobby for kids. She sits on her laptop in my house all day pretending to run a business while living entirely off my charity. She has absolutely zero real income. She should be down on her knees thanking me for keeping her child fed, instead of stealing my credit cards to buy emergency diapers like a common entitled thief. I slowly turned my head away from Patricia's sneering face and focused entirely on my husband, the man I had shared a bed with for 3 years, the man who promised to protect me. I waited for him to speak. I waited for him to shut his mother down, to loudly remind her that my UX/UI design agency had actually paid for our honeymoon to defend my career and my honor. I desperately needed him to prove that he was a man, a partner, a father who valued his family above his mother's wallet. Instead, Derek simply looked down at his expensive leather shoes. He crossed his arms over his chest and nodded silently in total agreement with his mother's vicious insults. In that exact moment, looking at his profound cowardice, something fundamental and irreversible broke inside my chest. The agonizing physical pain in my ankle faded into the background. The deep humiliation of being mocked and the desperation to make this toxic family dynamic work vanished instantly into thin air. I did not shed a single tear. My vision tunneled, stripping away the noise and the fear, leaving me with a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. I pushed myself away from the doorframe and stood up straighter, forcing myself to distribute weight onto my injured foot, refusing to look weak in front of them ever again. I stared directly into Derek's evasive, cowardly eyes. "I am packing my things right now," I stated clearly, my voice ringing out with a chilling calm that silenced the entire dining room. "I am going upstairs. I am getting the rest of Leo's belongings, and I am moving in with my father tonight. We are completely done." The moment those words left my mouth, the carefully constructed illusion of high society civility vanished. Patricia slammed her crystal wine glass onto the mahogany table with such force that the delicate stem snapped in half. Dark red wine spilled across the pristine white linen, pooling like blood, but she did not even blink. Her elegant, composed facade melted away instantly, revealing the absolute predator lurking underneath the designer gown. She stood up, kicking her velvet chair backwards so violently it toppled over onto the imported rug. Derek actually flinched, shrinking back into his seat, but Patricia ignored her son entirely. She took a step toward me, her eyes narrowing into cold, unblinking slits. The polite, passive-aggressive mother-in-law was gone. This was the woman who ruthlessly dominated country club boards and destroyed local businesses just for the thrill of the sport. "Walk out that door!" "Brianna and I freeze every single account you have," Patricia snarled, her voice dropping to a low, venomous register that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "I will restrict your access to the joint, checking the savings and the credit lines before you even reach the end of my driveway. You will not have a single dime to your name." I stood frozen, leaning heavily against the doorframe, trying to process the sheer malice in her threat. She was not just angry. She was strategically dismantling my entire existence. And that is just tonight, Patricia continued, taking another slow, predatory step forward. Tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, my lawyer files an emergency petition for full exclusive custody of my grandson. I have the best family law attorney in the entire state of Georgia on retainer. We will inform the judge that you are suffering a severe psychological breakdown. We will present your erratic behavior tonight, walking out into a violent thunderstorm with an infant as proof that you are an unstable, unfit mother. My breath caught in my throat. The room started to spin. She was weaponizing my escape against me. You are a homeless, unstable freelancer with absolutely zero reliable income. Patricia spat out a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across her face. You do not even own the car you were planning to drive away in. I have the resources, the legal power, and the social connections to bury you entirely. If you walk out that door tonight, I promise you this, Brianna, you will never see Leo again. The sheer terror of losing my baby hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Panic surged through my veins. She had the money to drag me through court for years. She had the power to twist the narrative to paint me as a deranged woman who endangered her child. I looked at Derek, desperately waiting for him to object to his mother threatening to take his son away from his wife. My husband simply looked down at his ruined stake, completely silent, utterly complicit in his mother's plot to destroy me. Before the panic could fully consume me, a massive shadow stepped in front of my line of sight. My father moved with a sudden, terrifying speed. He placed his broad shoulders squarely between Patricia and me, acting as an impenetrable physical wall. Thomas did not shout. He did not raise his voice or match Patricia's hysterical energy. Instead, he radiated the cold, calculated authority of a man who had spent 30 years dismantling corrupt financial empires for the federal government. He stepped right into Patricia's personal space, forcing her to look up at him. He looked her dead in the eye, his gaze entirely devoid of fear. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, Patricia," my father said. His voice was quiet, steady, and cut through the tension in the dining room like a razor blade. "You think your money makes you untouchable. You think you can hold my daughter hostage with financial terrorism. But you are arrogant, and arrogant people leave a trail. Do what you have to do tomorrow. But know this, I will tear your empire down to the studs to protect my family." Patricia actually took a step back, momentarily stunned by the absolute certainty in his voice. She was used to people cowering before her wealth, not challenging it head-on. Thomas turned slightly toward me, never completely taking his eyes off Patricia. "Go upstairs, Brianna," he instructed calmly. "Get the baby's bag, his bottles, and whatever documents you need. You have exactly 5 minutes. I will wait right here." I nodded, the adrenaline finally overpowering the sharp agony in my swollen ankle. I pushed off the doorframe and practically dragged myself up the sweeping marble staircase. I did not bother looking back at Derek. I threw open the door to Leo's nursery, grabbing his diaper bag, jamming in his formula, his favorite blanket, and a handful of clothes. I opened my dresser and grabbed my passport, my laptop, and the encrypted hard drive containing all my freelance client work. I shoved it all into a canvas tote bag. My hands were shaking violently, but my mind was completely focused on survival. When I limped back down the stairs, the dining room was dead silent. My father was still standing exactly where I left him, staring Patricia down. Derek had not moved an inch. I walked right past them, stepping over the threshold, and out into the freezing, relentless storm. Thomas followed right behind me, pulling the shattered mahogany doors shut with a heavy thud that finalized the separation. The rain instantly soaked through my clothes again, but the cold felt clarifying. I climbed into the passenger side of the truck, throwing my bags onto the floorboard. I turned around to check on Leo. He was still safely secured in his car seat, peacefully sleeping through the destruction of our old life. Thomas climbed into the driver's seat, wiped the rainwater from his face, and slammed the truck into gear. The tires spun briefly on the wet asphalt before catching traction. As we sped down the long, manicured driveway and passed through the heavy iron gates, I looked out into the darkness. The domestic dispute had officially ended. As the truck plunged onto the flooded highway heading toward my father's house, I pulled my laptop bag closer to my chest. Patricia had declared a war for my child and my survival, and I was going to fight back with everything I had. The stormy drive ended at my father's modest brick house on the outskirts of the city. The guest room bed was firm, but I barely slept, my mind racing with the terrifying logistics of survival. By dawn, the heavy rain had stopped, leaving a thick, humid fog over Atlanta. Leo woke up precisely at 6 in the morning, fussy and hungry. I checked my canvas tote bag and realized the hasty packing job the night before had left us dangerously short on essentials. We were down to the absolute last scoop of baby formula. Leaving Leo in my father's capable hands, I borrowed Thomas's old sedan and drove to the corner pharmacy. It was barely 7 in the morning, the harsh fluorescent lights of the store buzzing loudly in the empty aisles. I grabbed 2 large cans of premium formula, a bulk pack of diapers, and some baby wipes, feeling a dull throbbing ache in my swollen ankle with every step I took. I walked up to the lone cashier, a tired-looking teenager, who scanned the items methodically. The total came out to just under $80. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my primary debit card, the one linked to the joint account I shared with Derek. I swiped the card through the machine. It beeped, displaying a bright red declined message on the digital screen. I frowned, apologizing to the cashier, and wiped the magnetic strip on my shirt. Sometimes the chip reader was faulty. I inserted it again. The machine issued a harsh double beep. Declined. A cold prickle of dread started at the base of my neck. I pulled out my backup credit card, also linked to our primary banking profile. I tapped the card against the screen. Another decline message flashed. The cashier shifted uncomfortably, offering to hold the items behind the counter if I needed to call my bank. Heat flushed my cheeks. I grabbed my phone, stepping away from the register and moving into an empty aisle near the pharmacy counter to avoid the gaze of the few early morning shoppers. My fingers shook slightly as I opened the banking application on my phone. The biometric scanner unlocked the screen, loading the main dashboard. I stared at the numbers, my brain completely refusing to process the visual information. Available balance $0.00. I hit the refresh button, entirely convinced it was a network error or a temporary glitch in the application. The screen reloaded, displaying the exact same terrifying digits. I tapped frantically into the transaction history. At 2 o'clock in the morning, a single massive wire transfer had been initiated. Exactly $45,000 had been withdrawn and routed to an external blind trust. It was every single dime we had saved together. It was the down payment for a new house we had promised to buy. It was Leo's college starter fund. It was the money I had personally contributed from my grueling freelance UX/UI contracts over the past 3 years. Every cent was completely gone. My breath caught in my throat. Patricia had not waited until morning to execute her threat. She had frozen my access and authorized Derek to drain the joint accounts while I was sleeping. They had stripped me of my financial identity in the middle of the night. While I stood paralyzed in the pharmacy aisle, staring blankly at the empty account balance, my phone vibrated intensely in my palm. A new text message illuminated the lock screen. It was from Derek. I opened the message desperately, expecting an explanation, or perhaps a panicked alert that our accounts had been hacked by a third party. Instead, I read a cold, calculated taunt that made my blood run cold. "Come home and apologize to Mom, and I will transfer you some grocery money. Stop acting crazy." I read the words 3 times, feeling the blood turn to ice in my veins. This was not a banking error. This was a coordinated, deliberate financial ambush. Derek was not just a passive bystander. He was an active, willing participant in his mother's war against me. They had drained our life savings not to protect the assets, but to weaponize them. They knew I needed formula. They knew I needed diapers. They knew I had left with nothing but a canvas tote bag and the clothes on my back. The realization hit me with the destructive force of a freight train. They were not trying to reason with me. They were trying to starve me into submission. Patricia and Derek believed that if they cut off my ability to feed my child, I would have no choice but to come crawling back on my hands and knees. They expected me to beg for their charity, to accept a lifetime of subordination, and to never question their authority again. They were using my infant son's basic needs as a bargaining chip to force my surrender. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The message was perfectly crafted to make me feel small, referring to my completely rational response to abuse as acting crazy. It was textbook manipulation designed to make me question my own sanity while holding my survival hostage. They expected me to break down in tears right there in the pharmacy aisle. They expected me to type back a desperate, groveling apology. Instead, I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. The panic that had gripped me just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I opened my messaging application, deleted Derek's text without sending a single word in reply, and walked straight out of the pharmacy. I drove back to my father's house with a singular focus. The emotional phase of the separation was over. We were now operating in a theater of war, and I needed to gather my forces. I paced the worn wooden floorboards of my father's modest living room, my mind racing through a dozen different desperate scenarios. The digital clock on the microwave glowed bright green, ticking relentlessly toward 10 in the morning. Leo was finally asleep in the guest room, exhausted from the chaotic transition, while my father sat at the small kitchen table, methodically organizing his old financial auditing files. I had left the pharmacy empty-handed and broken my reality completely fractured by the realization that Patricia and Derek had stolen $45,000 of our life savings. I felt entirely cornered, stripped of my resources, and staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar legal machine. I needed a strategy, and I needed elite legal representation that I currently could not afford to hire. Just as a fresh wave of suffocating panic threatened to paralyze me, my cell phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter. I jumped, the sudden noise startling me in the quiet, tense house. I expected to see Derek's name flashing on the digital screen, ready to deliver another cruel ultimatum, or perhaps Patricia's high-priced legal team demanding my immediate surrender. Instead, the caller ID displayed a name that genuinely shocked me to my core. It was Jamal. Jamal was 36 years old, an incredibly sharp, highly successful African-American real estate attorney who happened to be married to Derek's older sister, Rachel. He was a man of impeccable style, quiet dignity, and fierce intellect. More importantly, he was the absolute only person in the entire extended family who commanded Patricia's respect and entirely intimidated her. He possessed a level of financial independence and legal expertise that she simply could not manipulate or control. I stared at the vibrating phone, hesitating for a split second. I wondered if Derek had dispatched his brother-in-law to serve as an intimidating legal mediator to force my compliance. I took a shaky breath, swiped the green accept button, and pressed the speaker cautiously to my ear. "Brianna, listen to me very carefully," Jamal said instantly. His voice was hushed, completely stripped of his usual booming courtroom confidence, and thick with an absolute, undeniable urgency. "I am speaking to you from an untraceable burner phone, and I only have a very small window of time before I need to step into a corporate deposition. Do not say anything, just listen to my instructions." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. I promised him I was listening, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet kitchen. "By noon today, Patricia's legal team is going to dispatch a courier directly to your father's house." Jamal warned, the words tumbling out in a rapid, precise cadence. "They are going to serve you with an emergency separation agreement drafted by the most ruthless family law firm in the city. The cover letter will sound incredibly accommodating and generous. It will explicitly promise to immediately restore your full access to the joint checking account and provide a massive permanent monthly stipend for Leo's expenses." The fatal catch is buried deep in the dense legal jargon on page 14. The document includes a total irrevocable surrender of your primary parental rights and full legal concession to Patricia, acting as Leo's primary financial and medical guardian. Do not sign a single page. Do not initial the margins. Do not even accept the physical envelope from the courier. Tell your father to send them completely away. I let out a shaky, terrified breath, feeling the remaining blood drain from my face. Jamal was handing me Patricia's entire deceptive playbook before she could even execute the first devastating play. He was actively betraying his mother-in-law to protect me. I know exactly about the $45,000. Jamal continued, his tone dropping even lower, vibrating with intense seriousness. I know they completely zeroed out your joint account last night. I asked him how he could possibly know that highly sensitive classified information. The malicious transfer had happened at exactly 2 in the morning, executed in total secrecy. I still have administrative access to the corporate legal portal for Patricia's estate planning. Jamal revealed, the sound of a closing door echoing faintly in the background. She forgot to revoke my viewing privileges after our last massive family dispute. I saw the digital wire transfer authorization cross the encrypted server early this morning. But here is the critical piece of information you desperately need to understand, Brianna. Derek thinks that money is currently sitting in a secure holding account managed by his personal broker. He thinks he is merely protecting his assets from a bitter divorce. He is an absolute, unbelievable fool. Patricia did not move that money into Derek's name or any joint family trust. She moved every single dime of your $45,000 into an offshore, untraceable blind trust registered exclusively under her own individual Social Security number. She stole from you, yes, but she also directly stole from her own son. Derek has absolutely zero legal or financial access to those funds. He is just as trapped as you are, he just does not realize it yet. A shocking, massive wave of realization washed over me. Patricia was not just starving me out to gain custody of Leo. She was actively ensuring Derek remained completely financially dependent on her as well. She was consolidating her total power over both of us, maintaining her position as the supreme puppet master of the family. I asked Jamal why he was taking such a colossal risk. Why was he jeopardizing his own standing in the family, his marriage to Rachel, to feed me this classified intelligence? If Patricia found out he was aiding my defense, she would unleash her entire legal department on his real estate firm and destroy his career. Jamal let out a dry, bitter chuckle that carried absolutely no warmth or humor. She already tried, Brianna, he stated, his voice hardening into a weapon. 5 years ago, when Rachel and I first got engaged, Patricia attempted the exact same financial abuse on my wife. She tried to force Rachel to sign a predatory prenuptial agreement that would have left her entirely destitute if we ever divorced. When I advised Rachel to reject it, Patricia froze Rachel's trust fund and actively tried to starve us out. She thought I was just some inexperienced junior associate she could easily intimidate and discard. She was gravely mistaken. I used every single ounce of my legal prowess to fight back. I systematically audited her dummy corporations, located the illegal tax shelters she was actively using to hide Rachel's legitimate inheritance, and explicitly threatened to hand the entire portfolio over to the Internal Revenue Service. Patricia backed down immediately. She absolutely despises me, but she respects my capacity to completely destroy her. I stared at the kitchen wall, my mind racing to process this incredible revelation. Jamal was not just a convenient ally, he was a battle-tested veteran of the exact same war I was currently fighting. I have been quietly watching her terrorize you for 3 years, Jamal stated, the fierce urgency in his voice returning. I watched her belittle your career, manipulate your husband, and treat you like an indentured servant. I promised Rachel I would never actively start an unprovoked war with her mother again, but I also promised myself I would not stand by and watch her obliterate another innocent woman. I have been quietly mapping out her illicit financial web for years, waiting for the right moment, waiting for someone brave enough to actually stand up to her tyranny. You walking out of that house last night was the exact catalyst I needed to finally expose her. My father walked quietly into the kitchen, sensing the magnitude of the phone call. He handed me a steaming cup of black coffee and gave me a firm, encouraging nod. I am sending a secure, encrypted email to your personal account right now, Jamal instructed. It contains the routing numbers for the blind trust, the digital signature logs showing Patricia executing the fraudulent transfer, and the direct contact information for a ruthless, brilliant family law attorney who owes me a massive favor. He will represent you pro bono. Patricia thrives in the dark Brianna. We are going to drag every single one of her dirty secrets directly into the blinding light. I thanked him, my voice finally steady and entirely devoid of any lingering fear. I told Jamal I was ready to burn her empire to the ground. Good, Jamal replied sharply. Check your email, hire the shark I recommended, and prepare for battle. I will be in touch. The line clicked dead. I lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen for a long moment. I was no longer a helpless victim stranded in a pharmacy without money to feed my child. I had hard evidence of financial fraud. I had a pro bono legal shark waiting for my call. And I had a brilliant, highly motivated insider feeding me Patricia's deepest, darkest secrets. The overwhelming sense of isolation vanished completely. I opened my laptop, pulled up my secure email client, and watched Jamal's encrypted message hit my inbox. I clicked the attached files, watching Patricia's illicit financial documents populate across my screen. My father pulled up a chair beside me, putting his reading glasses on. We had exactly 2 hours to prepare before Patricia's courier arrived with the fraudulent separation agreement. I opened the first document and started reading. For the next 2 hours, my father and I pored over the intricate web of offshore accounts and dummy corporations Jamal had exposed. The financial trail was incredibly complex, designed to confuse and exhaust any standard auditor. But Thomas was a 30-year veteran of federal investigations. He quickly decoded the routing numbers, pointing out exactly how Patricia had unlawfully isolated my $45,000. The sheer arrogance of her digital footprint was staggering. At exactly noon, a sleek black town car pulled into my father's driveway. A courier wearing a tailored suit stepped out holding a thick, sealed manila envelope. My father met him squarely on the front porch. He did not even let the man speak. Thomas simply refused to accept the package, ordering the courier off his property immediately. We had successfully deflected her first attack, but the heavy silence that settled over the house afterward felt entirely ominous. Patricia was not a woman who accepted rejection gracefully. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the reflection of flashing red and blue lights suddenly bounced off the living room walls. I shot up from the kitchen table, my heart slamming violently against my ribs. Through the front window, I saw 2 marked police cruisers parked haphazardly on the front lawn. Right behind them was a drab, unmarked gray sedan. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands resting cautiously near their heavy utility belts. A woman holding a clipboard and wearing a stern, deeply judgmental expression emerged from the gray sedan. It was Child Protective Services. Patricia had actually done it. She had followed through on her horrific ultimatum and weaponized the state authorities against me. A heavy, incredibly authoritative knock rattled the front door. I instinctively sprinted down the hallway toward the guest room. I scooped Leo out of his portable crib, clutching his warm, fragile body tightly against my chest. My mind raced with terrifying images of state workers physically ripping my son from my arms. Panic constricted my throat, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Thomas placed a steady, incredibly calming hand on my shoulder. He instructed me to stay in the living room to keep the baby calm and to let him handle the interrogation. He turned and pulled open the front door with absolute, unshakable confidence. The lead police officer introduced himself and stated they were responding to an urgent emergency dispatch. He claimed the original caller, identified explicitly as my mother-in-law, reported a kidnapping in progress. The officer stated that Patricia accused me of suffering a severe, violent psychological breakdown. She had formally asserted to dispatch that I posed an immediate critical danger to the life of my infant son. The woman from Child Protective Services stepped forward aggressively, demanding to inspect the child and evaluate my mental fitness. She held up her clipboard, rattling off state legal codes regarding child endangerment and emergency custody removals. My father did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. He stood his ground, radiating the icy, unyielding authority of a man who had interrogated hostile federal tax evaders for decades. He calmly requested the officer's badge numbers and the social worker's identification, methodically writing them down on a yellow legal pad. Then he began dismantling Patricia's fabricated emergency with surgical precision. Thomas clearly stated to the officers that I was the biological mother and was currently fully married to the child's father. He firmly educated the police that without a finalized court order or an active emergency custody mandate, a mother leaving a toxic domestic environment with her own child is legally not classified as kidnapping. It is entirely a civil dispute. He then invited the social worker into the brightly lit, immaculate living room to observe Leo. My son was clean, perfectly healthy, and happily babbling in my arms, completely unharmed. My father pointed out the fresh diapers, the premium baby formula, and the safe sleeping environment visible just down the hall. Thomas did not stop at simply proving Leo was safe. He shifted the dynamic entirely. He pulled out his phone and showed the officers the digital banking records. He explained that my husband and mother-in-law had maliciously zeroed out my joint bank accounts in the middle of the night. He showed them the transfer logs proving they had stolen $45,000 to financially paralyze a mother and her infant child. He presented the situation not as a woman having a mental breakdown, but as a textbook case of severe financial abuse and domestic coercion. He calmly informed the officers that Patricia was filing a false police report, wasting city resources, in a calculated attempt to use law enforcement as a tool for illegal intimidation. The officers exchanged a long, incredibly uneasy glance. The dramatic narrative Patricia had spun over the phone was falling apart rapidly under the weight of hard evidence and my father's unshakable logic. The social worker made a few quick notes on her clipboard, her demeanor shifting entirely from accusatory to apologetic. She acknowledged that the baby was in absolutely no immediate danger and that the living conditions were perfectly adequate. The lead officer tipped his hat, stating that this was clearly a civil matter meant for family court, and firmly advised us to contact a lawyer. They retreated to their vehicles, turning off their flashing lights, and drove away, leaving the quiet suburban street in peace. As the taillights disappeared around the corner, the adrenaline drained from my body, leaving behind a cold, hard knot of absolute rage. I looked down at Leo, tracing the soft curve of his cheek. Patricia had genuinely tried to have my baby taken away by state authorities. She had tried to have me locked in a psychiatric hold. She had crossed a moral and legal line that could never be uncrossed. The psychological terror of those 10 minutes, the very real visceral threat of losing my son, ignited a blazing inferno inside my soul. I was no longer just trying to survive or escape. I wanted total, undeniable retribution. I turned to my father, my eyes narrowed and my voice steady. I told him to call the pro bono shark Jamal recommended. We were officially going to war. My father did not waste a single second. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and immediately dialed the number Jamal had provided. He stepped out onto the back patio, speaking in low, rapid-fire sentences. I remained in the kitchen, my hands braced against the countertops, waiting for the adrenaline of the police encounter to stop violently surging through my veins. When Thomas walked back inside, his jaw was set with grim determination. He had secured a consultation for 8 o'clock the following morning with the most ruthless family law attorney in Atlanta. But before we could walk into that high-stakes meeting, we needed to arm our new legal counsel with absolute, undeniable proof of Patricia's malicious actions. We needed to decode the digital payload Jamal had promised to deliver. I retrieved my laptop from the canvas tote bag and plugged it into the kitchen wall outlet. I opened my secure email client, watching the loading icon spin. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, a message arrived from an anonymous encrypted server address. The subject line was completely blank. The body of the email contained a single complex password sequence and a temporary link to a secure cloud storage drive. I clicked the link, entering the decryption key with shaking fingers. A massive zip file began downloading to my local hard drive. The progress bar crept across the screen, agonizingly slow, downloading gigabytes of raw, unfiltered financial intelligence straight from the highly guarded servers of Patricia's empire. Once the download completed, I extracted the files directly onto my desktop. Thomas cleared away the remains of our lunch, wiping the wooden table clean before spreading out his yellow legal pads, highlighters, and reading glasses. He pulled up a dining chair beside me, his entire demeanor shifting. The protective, fiercely loyal father vanished seamlessly, replaced by the cold, calculating federal financial auditor who had spent 3 decades hunting down white-collar criminals. He cracked his knuckles, adjusted his glasses, and instructed me to open the primary master directory. The screen flooded with hundreds of meticulously categorized PDF documents, routing logs, dummy corporation tax returns, and offshore banking statements. Jamal had provided us with the absolute holy grail of corporate espionage. Thomas began clicking through the folders, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon and numerical columns at a speed I could barely comprehend. He took rapid shorthand notes on his legal pad, cross-referencing dates from the offshore blind trust with domestic wire transfer records. The sheer volume of Patricia's illicit financial maneuvering was staggering. She operated a labyrinth of shell companies, moving money through multiple dummy accounts to avoid tax liabilities and obscure her true net worth. Hours slipped by unnoticed. The late afternoon sun cast long, angular shadows across the kitchen floor. I left the table briefly to feed Leo his afternoon bottle and rock him back to sleep in the quiet guest room. When I returned to the kitchen, the atmosphere had shifted drastically. The rapid clicking of the mouse and the scratching of the pen had stopped completely. The room was dead silent. Thomas was staring blankly at the glowing laptop screen. He had taken his reading glasses off and was holding them loosely in his right hand. The color had completely drained from his face. His normally ruddy complexion had turned a sickly ashen gray. He looked physically ill, as if he had just witnessed a horrific accident. I rushed to his side, my heart dropping into my stomach. I asked him what he had found, terrified that Patricia had somehow legally trapped us or outmaneuvered Jamal's intelligence. Thomas did not speak immediately. He slowly turned the laptop monitor toward me. He pointed a trembling finger at a series of scanned documents labeled as commercial real estate loan applications and corporate registry filings originating from the state of Delaware. At first glance, the paperwork looked identical to the dozens of other shell company documents we had reviewed. But as I leaned in closer, my eyes locked onto the primary guarantor listed at the top of the loan origination form. It was my name, Brianna Vance. I stopped breathing. I stared at the screen, my brain refusing to process the information. Below my printed name was my exact date of birth. Below that was my private social security number. On the final page of the document, a digital signature perfectly matching my own handwriting authorized the binding legal agreement. Patricia had not just drained $45,000 from a joint banking account. She had completely and entirely stolen my identity. Thomas finally found his voice, though it was hollow and laced with absolute horror. He explained the catastrophic reality hidden within the numbers. Over the past 2 years, Patricia had quietly registered 3 separate, highly leveraged shell companies using my stolen Social Security number as the foundational corporate officer. Utilizing those phantom corporations, she had systematically secured exactly $150,000 in fraudulent commercial real estate loans. The loans were not being serviced. They were actively defaulting. Patricia had engineered a massive, devastating financial time bomb and strapped it directly to my personal credit profile. When the banks eventually foreclosed on the commercial properties, the catastrophic debt would fall entirely on my shoulders. I would be legally responsible for $150,000 I had never seen. I would be bankrupted, my credit utterly destroyed, making it impossible to rent an apartment, buy a car, or secure an independent future for Leo. A sickening realization washed over me. I knew exactly how Patricia had acquired my highly sensitive personal information. During my first year of marriage to Derek, Patricia had generously offered to have her elite private corporate accountant handle our joint tax returns to save us money. I had naively handed my mother-in-law a pristine manila folder containing my original W-2 forms, my freelance design invoices, and a physical copy of my Social Security card. I had freely handed the predator the absolute keys to my entire financial existence. The heavy gravity of the situation settled over the kitchen like a suffocating blanket. We were no longer dealing with a bitter mother-in-law or a toxic divorce. Patricia had crossed a terrifying, irreversible threshold. Thomas slowly looked up at me, his eyes burning with a dark, lethal intensity. "This isn't family drama anymore, Bree," Thomas stated, his voice ringing with absolute chilling certainty. "This is identity theft and federal tax fraud." My father explained the severe federal mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for wire fraud, identity theft across state lines, and tax evasion. Patricia had arrogantly stepped out of the jurisdiction of local family court and directly into the crosshairs of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. If convicted of these specific charges, Patricia was looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. The woman who had just tried to use Child Protective Services to take my son away was actively running a massive illegal criminal enterprise, using me as her unknowing scapegoat. The last lingering shred of fear inside me dissolved, replaced by a cold-hardened armor. We possessed the weapon that could annihilate her empire. The heavy silence in the kitchen was absolute, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. We possessed the weapon that could annihilate her empire. Thomas immediately reached for his phone to contact his former federal colleagues, his mind firmly locked on Patricia and her impending criminal charges. But as I stared at the digital copies of the fraudulent loan applications, a completely different, deeply unsettling thought began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. Jamal had explicitly stated that Derek was a fool, a clueless pawn who had been financially trapped by his own mother without his knowledge. That assessment simply did not align with the man I had married. Derek was arrogant, entitled, and incredibly lazy, but he was absolutely not oblivious to money. He checked his stock portfolios obsessively. He monitored every dime I ever spent on groceries. The idea that Patricia could orchestrate a massive, highly complex real estate fraud using my identity without Derek catching a single whisper of the scheme felt entirely wrong. I refused to believe my husband was merely a collateral victim in his mother's war. I knew his habits, his supreme overconfidence, and his fatal flaws. More importantly, I knew his digital footprint intimately. As a senior UX/UI designer, my entire career was built on understanding user behavior, mapping data, architecture, and predicting how people interacted with digital ecosystems. Derek possessed zero technical literacy. He relied entirely on me to set up his devices, manage our home network, and configure his passwords during our first year of marriage. I pulled the laptop back toward me, opening a new encrypted browser window. When we first moved in together, I had established a master family cloud storage account to sync our calendars and share photo albums. We stopped using it actively years ago, migrating to separate corporate drives, but I knew Derek. He never updated his legacy settings. He never purged old hardware syncing protocols. If he was hiding something, the automated background backups on his current devices would still be quietly mirroring data to that forgotten dormant server. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I navigated to the login portal of the legacy cloud provider. I entered the old administrative credentials, holding my breath as the two-factor authentication prompt appeared. A verification code was instantly routed to my ancient secondary email address, the one I had designated as the master recovery account long before Patricia began her campaign of isolation. I inputted the 6-digit code. The screen loaded, granting me unrestricted master-level access to the server. I bypassed the superficial folders containing old vacation photos and expired digital coupons. I dove straight into the raw, unformatted backup directories. I located a device registry named Derek Private Phone. The automated sync log showed it had successfully backed up just 3 hours ago. He was walking around with a live digital wiretap in his pocket, completely unaware that his laziness had left the back door to his entire life wide open. I initiated a mass download of his text message archives, private email caches, and hidden photo albums. The data poured onto my screen, an unfiltered chronological timeline of my husband's actual existence. I opened the messaging logs between Derek and Patricia, running a quick keyword search for my name and my social security number. The results populated instantly, and the crushing, undeniable truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. Jamal was wrong. Derek was not a victim. He was a fully complicit, active co-conspirator. I read through months of encrypted text exchanges. Derek had actively provided Patricia with my personal financial details. He had explicitly forwarded her the high-resolution scan of my social security card. In a message dated nearly 18 months ago, he complained bitterly about my freelance design income being deposited into a separate account, directly suggesting that Patricia utilize my credit profile to secure the commercial real estate loans instead of risking their own capital. He knew exactly what she was doing. He had authorized the identity theft, casually tossing my financial future into the meat grinder, simply because it benefited his ultimate inheritance. Bile rose in my throat, but the icy resolve taking over my nervous system pushed the nausea down. I continued digging, pulling up his secondary email cache. I found a hidden, heavily encrypted subfolder buried inside his deleted items directory. I bypassed the weak security protocol and opened the file. It was a mountain of financial documents completely separate from Patricia's offshore blind trust. These were real estate escrow agreements, massive wire transfer receipts from a private checking account I never knew existed, and a finalized, officially notarized property deed. I zoomed in on the documentation, reading the specifics of the transaction. Derek was actively closing on a luxury $3 million penthouse in the most exclusive high-rise building in downtown Atlanta. The wire transfers showed he had been quietly siphoning his massive annual corporate bonuses into this hidden account for 3 years, deliberately starving our joint savings while claiming we needed to be frugal. But the most devastating detail was not the stolen money or the secret penthouse. It was the name printed clearly on the official property deed as the sole legal owner. The penthouse did not belong to Derek. It did not belong to Patricia. The deed was registered exclusively to Monica Sterling. Monica was a 24-year-old junior account executive at Derek's marketing firm. She was the woman he had repeatedly brought to corporate dinners, the woman he claimed was just a persistent, overly ambitious mentee who needed professional guidance. I had cooked dinner for her. I had welcomed her into my home. The entire scope of the betrayal crystallized on my screen. Derek was not just facilitating his mother's financial crimes against me. He was systematically funding a completely secret, wildly extravagant parallel life with his mistress. While I was clipping coupons, agonizing over the cost of baby formula, and enduring Patricia's relentless psychological torture, my husband was buying a multi-million-dollar sky mansion for a junior executive. He had looked me straight in the eyes, gaslighted me into believing I was paranoid, and dismissed my postpartum struggles as irrational anxiety, all while plotting to abandon me with $150,000 in fraudulent federal debt. I did not cry. There were absolutely no tears left to shed. The woman who had packed a canvas tote bag and fled into the rain the night before was completely gone, incinerated by the sheer magnitude of this treachery. I selected every single document, every text log, every wire transfer, and hit print. The quiet hum of my father's laser printer filled the kitchen as it churned out the hard evidence of my husband's complete moral bankruptcy. I gathered the warm, freshly printed pages and slammed them down on the table next to Patricia's federal tax fraud files. I was going to take everything from them. Absolutely everything. I gathered the warm, freshly printed pages and slammed them down on the table next to Patricia's federal tax fraud files. I was going to take everything from them. Absolutely everything. The last remnants of the woman who had cried in the pharmacy evaporated, replaced by a hyper-focused mechanical precision. I did not shed another tear. The sorrow was completely gone, burned away by a cold, calculated rage that demanded absolute annihilation. I looked at my father. He read the shift in my posture and understood immediately. He cleared the remaining clutter from the dining room table, hauling in 2 large dry erase boards from his home office. Within minutes, the cozy suburban dining space was completely unrecognizable. It had become a tactical command center. My laptop sat at the center of the table connected to a secure encrypted video link. Jamal's face filled the screen broadcasting from the locked interior of his private office. When I held up the printed deed for the $3 million penthouse registered to Monica Sterling, Jamal went completely silent. He stared at the camera, his jaw tight. He muttered that he had drastically underestimated Derek's sheer brazen stupidity. With the full scope of the betrayal now lying on the table, our three-way alliance locked into a singular, devastating focus. We went completely off the grid. For the next 72 hours, the house operated in a state of perpetual, relentless motion. We barely slept, surviving on black coffee and stale delivery food. Leo remained happily oblivious, watched over by a trusted retired neighbor my father brought in to help, allowing me to dedicate every waking second to dismantling Patricia's empire. I utilized my background in data architecture to map out the digital flow of the stolen capital. I built a massive interconnected timeline on the first whiteboard, tracing every single dime. We charted the exact trajectory of my stolen $45,000, tracking it from our joint checking account straight into Patricia's offshore blind trust. We mapped Derek's secret bonus diversions, establishing a clear, undeniable financial pipeline directly from his corporate earnings to Monica's luxury penthouse. Every transaction was meticulously documented, time-stamped, and verified by the digital footprint Derek had so carelessly left exposed. While Jamal and I mapped the digital infrastructure, Thomas went to work validating the federal crimes. He operated with the quiet, lethal efficiency of a man who had spent his entire career hunting corporate ghosts. He pulled out an old, beat-up leather address book and began making highly classified, off-the-record phone calls. He reached out to former colleagues still deeply embedded within the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Financial Crimes Division. He did not give them my name or Patricia's identity, but he fed them the Delaware routing numbers, the specific structural frameworks of the shell companies, and the loan origination codes. The confirmation came back faster than we anticipated. Thomas hung up the phone after a 20-minute conversation with a senior federal auditor, his face etched with grim satisfaction. He looked at Jamal on the monitor and then at me. The shell companies were not just active, they were highly radioactive. Patricia was aggressively using my stolen Social Security number to cross-collateralize commercial properties, artificially inflating their value to secure even larger fraudulent loans. It was a classic, highly illegal pyramid scheme. If one property folded, the entire structure would collapse, triggering a massive, unavoidable federal investigation. She was operating a financial house of cards, and my identity was the only thing propping it up. We had the motive, we had the digital fingerprints, and we had the federal verification. It was time to forge the weapon. We spent the final 24 hours assembling the ultimate dossier. This was not a standard legal complaint or a basic divorce filing. It was an ironclad, indisputable manifesto of total financial and psychological destruction. We organized the documents into 3 distinct, devastating sections, cross-referencing every digital file with hard physical evidence. Section 1 contained the irrefutable proof of Patricia's identity theft, including the forged Delaware corporate registries and the active fraudulent commercial loans secured under my name. It featured the tax codes she had violated and the federal mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines corresponding to each crime. Section 2 outlined the blatant coordinated theft of our marital life savings, complete with the time-stamped digital wire transfer logs and the offshore routing numbers Jamal had extracted. Section 3 was entirely dedicated to Derek. It contained the luxury penthouse deed in his mistress's name, the hidden banking ledgers, and the grotesque text messages proving he had actively facilitated his mother's financial crimes to protect his inheritance while secretly funding his affair. By dawn on the 4th day, the dossier was complete. It sat in the center of the dining room table, bound in a thick, heavy black binder. It was a masterpiece of legal and digital forensics, a lethal combination of Thomas's auditing expertise, my digital extraction skills, and Jamal's ruthless legal maneuvering. Jamal reviewed the final encrypted PDF version of the binder through the video link. He nodded slowly, a predatory smile crossing his features. He declared that it was a total kill shot. There was no legal maneuvering, no high-priced defense attorney, and no amount of generational wealth that could protect Patricia or Derek from the contents of that binder. I ran my fingers over the smooth, dark cover of the dossier. The exhaustion of the past 72 hours faded into the background, replaced by a surging electric sense of power. They had pushed me into a corner expecting me to break, expecting me to beg for their charity. They had underestimated me at every single turn. Instead of surrendering, I had mapped their entire criminal enterprise and boxed them in with inescapable federal evidence. The war room was quiet now, the chaotic energy of the past 3 days settling into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I looked at my father, who offered a grim, approving nod, then back at the monitor. I told Jamal to make the call. It was time to drop the bomb. I told Jamal to make the call. It was time to drop the bomb. But before Jamal could even formally file the devastating dossier with the federal authorities, or serve Derek with the impending litigation, the enemy made a preemptive, spectacularly arrogant move. Jamal had simply sent a standard notice of representation to Patricia's retained family law firm legally and officially informing them that I was no longer an unrepresented, helpless target. We expected a standard legal acknowledgement. Instead, less than 4 hours after Jamal's email went out, a private courier in a sharp gray uniform marched up my father's driveway. He carried a pristine, cream-colored envelope sealed with heavy gold wax. It was addressed to me, but the embossed return address belonged to Patricia's elite corporate legal team. Thomas signed for the package, his brow furrowed in suspicion, and brought it back into the dining room. I broke the wax seal, my heart maintaining a steady, icy rhythm. I slid the contents onto the table. There were 2 distinct items. The first was a heavy letterpress invitation to the Atlanta Heritage Country Club's annual Winter Charity Gala, scheduled for this coming Saturday evening. Patricia's name was printed at the very top in bold, elegant script, proudly identifying her as the chairwoman of the board of directors and the primary host of the city's most exclusive high society event. The second item was a dense 20-page legal contract bound in blue backing. I handed the contract to Thomas, who immediately adjusted his reading glasses and began scanning the dense legalese. As his eyes moved down the first page, a sound escaped his throat. It was not a gasp of fear, but a short, sharp bark of genuine amusement. He shook his head, sliding the document toward the laptop camera so Jamal could read the summary page. Patricia and Derek were not retreating. They were doubling down on their delusion of absolute control. The document was a highly aggressive, heavily punitive post-nuptial agreement paired with a formal binding custody surrender. Jamal summarized the terms aloud, his voice dripping with professional disgust. Patricia had orchestrated a spectacularly insulting bribe wrapped in a suffocating ultimatum. The cover letter, signed by Derek, stated that the sudden separation was an embarrassment to the family name and threatened to tarnish their impeccable social standing just days before Patricia's crowning charitable achievement. They demanded that I attend the gala this weekend. I was ordered to put on a designer gown, stand by Derek's side, and smile for the society photographers, projecting the flawless illusion of a happy, unified family to the Atlanta elite. If I agreed to play the obedient, silent wife for exactly 4 hours, and if I signed the postnuptial contract before walking into the ballroom, Patricia would graciously activate her bribe. The terms of her supposed generosity were nauseating. I was to officially surrender any and all financial claims to the marital estate, waiving my right to alimony asset division and the contents of our joint accounts. Far worse, the contract demanded I sign over primary physical and legal custody of Leo directly to Derek, relegating me to standard supervised weekend visitations. In exchange for selling my child and abandoning my financial future, Patricia generously promised to instruct the towing company to release my Mercedes SUV back into my possession. Furthermore, she offered a patronizing, meager monthly allowance, barely enough to cover rent in a low-income apartment complex, completely contingent on my continued silence and absolute compliance. She genuinely believed she could buy me off with a used car and a monthly stipend. She believed my terror of losing Leo to her high-priced lawyers would force me to sign away my rights just to guarantee a roof over my head. She was attempting to purchase my surrender for pennies while simultaneously parading me around her country club to preserve her pristine public image. I stared at the embossed gala invitation. A week ago, the mere thought of navigating a ballroom full of Patricia's wealthy, judgmental peers would have sent me into a spiral of severe social anxiety. I would have dreaded the whispers, the condescending glances, and the exhausting effort required to pretend I belonged in their world. But as I looked at the gold lettering now, I felt absolutely no fear. I felt the cold, thrilling rush of tactical advantage. Patricia was obsessed with optics. Her entire empire, her social standing, and her psychological warfare relied on presenting a flawless, untouchable facade to the world. The charity gala was the epicenter of her power, the very stage where she expected to shine brightest in front of the city's most influential politicians, business leaders, and socialites. She wanted me there as a prop, a conquered accessory to prove her family was immune to scandal. Thomas set the contract down, folding his arms across his chest. He looked at me, waiting for my reaction. Through the laptop speakers, Jamal asked if he should draft a hostile rejection letter and inform them we would see them in federal court. I shook my head, my eyes locked on the invitation. A quiet, dangerous realization had fully formed in my mind. Dropping our meticulously prepared dossier directly onto the desks of federal prosecutors would undoubtedly secure Patricia's criminal downfall. But it would be a quiet, bureaucratic victory hidden behind the closed doors of courtrooms and government offices. Patricia thrived in the shadows. She manipulated the truth behind closed doors. To truly break her, to ensure she could never again look down her nose and destroy another life, the destruction needed to be spectacular. It needed to be intensely, inescapably public. I picked up the invitation, tapping the thick cardstock against the table. I looked up at the camera and told Jamal to hold the federal filings. I instructed him to reply to Patricia's legal team immediately. He was to tell them that I was carefully considering their generous offer, that I understood the importance of family unity, and that I would absolutely be attending the country club charity gala on Saturday night. My father's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but as he studied my expression, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He understood exactly what I was planning. Patricia wanted a public spectacle to cement her dominance. She was going to get one. I was not going to sign her pathetic post-nuptial agreement, and I was certainly not going to surrender my son. I was going to accept her invitation, walk into her glittering ballroom, and detonate the bomb right in the middle of her crowning achievement. We were taking the war directly to the country club. I picked up my cell phone, the glass cold against my palm. Thomas leaned back against the edge of the dining room table, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, watching me with a mix of paternal concern and sharp tactical calculation. On the laptop screen, Jamal muted his microphone, leaning in close to the camera lens. The room was utterly still. To execute this maneuver properly, to ensure Patricia and Derek walked blindly into their own public execution, I had to convince them that their psychological warfare had worked perfectly. I had to become the broken, helpless victim they desperately needed me to be. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, ragged breath. I channeled every ounce of fear I had felt when I was standing in the freezing rain outside the pharmacy. I summoned the suffocating panic of staring at my empty bank accounts, the sheer desperation of holding my crying baby, and the raw, visceral terror of losing my son. I let those dark emotions rise, filling my chest until my throat actually constricted. When I opened my eyes, the cold designer of destruction was temporarily gone. I hit the call button on Derek's contact and put the phone on speaker, laying it flat on the wooden table. The line rang twice before Derek answered. "What do you want, Brianna?" His voice was dripping with absolute contempt, laced with the lazy arrogance of a man who firmly believed he had already won the war. I let out a shuddering breath, ensuring it caught the phone's microphone perfectly. I forced a wet, pathetic sob from my throat. "Derek, please," I whispered, letting my voice intentionally crack and waver. "Please, just listen to me." "I am listening to my lawyer," he snapped. "Did you get the courier delivery or not? Because my mother is running out of patience, and quite frankly, so am I." "I got it." I choked out, allowing another heavy dramatic sob to escape. I read it. Derek, you cannot take Leo from me. Please. I do not have any money left. The accounts are completely frozen. The landlord is threatening to evict me. I have absolutely nothing. Thomas watched me from across the table, his eyes wide with genuine shock at the sheer terrifying authenticity of my despair. I covered my face with one hand, weeping openly and loudly into the phone. I surrender, Derek. I cannot fight you and your mother anymore. You win. I will do whatever Patricia wants. There was a heavy, pregnant pause on the line. I could practically hear his ego inflating, absorbing my manufactured misery like pure oxygen. You are finally being realistic, he said, his tone shifting from angry to sickeningly patronizing. I told you this would happen. You always were overly emotional and completely incapable of handling real pressure. I am sorry, I wailed, leaning closer to the speaker. I am so sorry. Just tell Patricia I will be there. I will come to the gala on Saturday. I will stand right next to you and I will sign those papers in front of everyone. Just please give me back my car and do not take my baby. Derek let out a short, dismissive laugh. It was the exact same laugh I had heard 1,000 times when he was belittling my career or mocking my friends. Of course you will, he stated flatly, because you literally have no other choice. My mother is being incredibly generous by offering you that allowance, Brianna. You should be thanking her on your knees. I will, I cried softly. I will do whatever it takes to keep things peaceful. Good, he barked. Now listen to me very carefully. This gala is the most important night of the year for the family. The mayor is going to be there. The board of directors will be watching. You are going to walk in, you are going to smile, and you are going to play the part of the supportive, grateful wife. And for God's sake, Brianna, make an effort. I sniffled, playing the part of the battered wife flawlessly. What do you mean? I mean, wear something that actually fits in, he sneered, his voice laced with venom. Do not show up in one of those cheap, off-the-rack dresses you usually wear. Buy something presentable. Put it on the emergency credit card if you have to. I do not care. Just do not embarrass us. Be at the club at exactly 7 o'clock. My mother's lawyer will have the final contracts waiting in the private VIP lounge. I will be there, I whispered, letting my voice fade into a pathetic whimper. I promise. Derek hung up without another word. The sharp dial tone echoed loudly through the dining room. I stared at the phone for exactly 3 seconds. The silence stretched tight across the room. Then the tears stopped. Instantly. The fabricated trembling in my hands vanished completely, replaced by an absolute rock-solid stillness. I wiped the stray moisture from my cheeks with the back of my hand, my posture straightening as the cold, lethal composure flooded back into my veins. The psychological transition was so abrupt, so brutally violent that Thomas actually let out a low whistle of disbelief. On the monitor, Jamal threw his head back and laughed aloud, the sound cutting through the tension. Remind me to never ever cross you in a negotiation, Brianna. That was genuinely terrifying. I did not smile. I picked up my phone, ended the speaker connection, and placed it face down on the table. The Trojan horse was officially inside the gates. Patricia and Derek had gleefully swallowed the bait, entirely convinced I was a broken, desperate woman, coming to surrender my entire life to their charity. They were expecting a helpless victim in a cheap dress. They were expecting a public capitulation to solidify their elite status. I turned to my father, my eyes locking onto his with unwavering intensity. The time for digital mapping and secret ledgers was over. It was time to manifest our destruction into the physical world. I pointed a steady finger at the heavy black binder sitting in the center of the table. Print the federal fraud files, I commanded, my voice ringing with absolute chilling certainty. Make 3 hard copies of the entire dossier. Use high-gloss paper. Use color ink for the wire transfers and the penthouse deed. Put them in premium leather binders. We are crashing a gala. Saturday evening descended on Atlanta with a biting, bitter chill that perfectly matched the ice running through my veins. The days of weeping in oversized sweatpants and drowning in panic were completely dead. Tonight required armor. I bypassed the conservative, muted dresses Derek had always approved of the pastel fabrics specifically designed to make me blend into the background of his life. Instead, I reached into the very back of my closet and pulled out a garment I had purchased years ago for a National Design Awards ceremony, but had never worn because Derek deemed it too aggressive. It was a floor-length, razor-sharp, crimson silk gown. It featured a plunging, architectural neckline, severely structured shoulders, and a daring slit that demanded absolute attention. It was not the dress of a defeated, broken mother begging for scraps. It was a lethal declaration of war. I applied my makeup with meticulous mechanical precision. I drew a sharp winged eyeliner painted on a bold red lip that perfectly matched the silk and pulled my hair back into a severe, elegant twist that left my face entirely exposed. I slipped my feet into 4-inch black stiletto heels. Thomas stood at the bottom of the staircase, holding a sleek black leather satchel containing the 3 printed high-gloss dossiers. He looked at me, a fierce, primal pride burning in his eyes, and handed me the bag. We drove to the Atlanta Heritage Country Club in absolute silence, the weight of the impending destruction sitting heavily on the leather seats between us. The country club was a sprawling, opulent estate illuminated by hundreds of twinkling fairy lights and massive spotlights. Valets in crisp white jackets rushed frantically to open the doors of arriving Bentleys, Porsches, and black town cars. I stepped out into the crisp night air, the heavy leather satchel hanging securely from my shoulder. The grand entrance was flanked by towering, extravagant ice sculptures and massive arrangements of imported white orchids. I walked up the marble steps, the sharp click of my stilettos echoing with a steady rhythmic cadence. The main ballroom was a cavernous, intimidating space drenched in the light of massive crystal chandeliers draped in heavy gold fabrics and suffocating under the hum of old money. Hundreds of Atlanta's most influential socialites, local politicians, and corporate titans mingled freely, sipping champagne in tailored tuxedos and glittering diamonds. I paused at the threshold, letting the heavy oak doors shut solidly behind me. The crimson silk of my gown practically caught fire under the brilliant overhead lighting. I did not look at the floor. I kept my chin perfectly level, my shoulders pulled back tightly, and walked straight into the lion's den. Heads began to turn almost immediately. The loud, buzzing conversations faltered, dropping into sharp, hushed whispers. The visual impact of the crimson gown against the sea of predictable black navy and silver evening wear was immediate, jarring, and undeniable. I watched the crowd part slightly, making way for me as people recognized my face. The estranged daughter-in-law, the subject of a week's worth of vicious elite country club gossip, had arrived. But instead of hiding in the shadows or slinking in through a side door, I was walking right through the exact center of the room with absolute unyielding authority. Derek spotted me from across the room. He was standing near the grand sweeping staircase holding a crystal tumbler of scotch surrounded by a tight group of his corporate peers. I watched his eyes track my approach. For a fraction of a second, raw shock registered on his face. He had explicitly ordered me to wear something that did not look cheap, undoubtedly expecting a quiet, submissive, entirely forgettable garment to mask my supposed humiliation. He had completely miscalculated. However, his colossal ego quickly took over. He masked his surprise with a smug, deeply arrogant smirk, entirely convinced that my striking appearance was simply a desperate, pathetic attempt to win back his approval. Utterly oblivious to the lethal reality I was carrying inside the black satchel, he excused himself from his circle and strode confidently toward me. He reached out and grabbed my elbow, his grip tight, painful, and overwhelmingly possessive. "You actually pulled yourself together," he muttered, leaning in close so the surrounding guests could not hear his condescension. "Good. You look expensive. Now keep your mouth shut, smile for the cameras, and follow my lead. Do exactly what we discussed, sign the papers quickly, and my mother will let you keep the SUV." I did not flinch. I did not pull my arm away. I let him pull me forward perfectly, playing the role of the compliant, beaten wife, being paraded through the gala. We navigated through the thick sea of wealthy guests, moving directly toward the very front of the ballroom. The VIP table was positioned on a raised velvet-lined dais, commanding a panoramic, unobstructed view of the entire event. It was the absolute center of gravity for the gala, surrounded by the city's highest-ranking officials, judges, and deepest pockets. Sitting at the absolute center of the table, holding court like a conquering monarch, was Patricia. She was draped in heavy emerald velvet, a massive blinding diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. She was laughing loudly at a joke made by the city's mayor, projecting the ultimate, impenetrable image of untouchable grace and immense power. As Derek led me up the short flight of velvet stairs to the VIP tier, Patricia's cold eyes locked onto mine. Her loud laughter stopped abruptly, replaced immediately by a wicked, triumphant, blood-chilling smile. She surveyed my crimson gown, her gaze lingering on my face, searching hungrily for the fear, the tears, and the desperation she was so absolutely certain I possessed. She found nothing but a blank, stoic mask. She gestured to an empty chair directly across the table from her, ensuring that dozens of high society guests at the neighboring tables had a clear, unobstructed view of our interaction. "Brianna, darling." Patricia projected her voice, loudly coding her words with a thick, sickening layer of fake Southern hospitality designed to draw the attention of the surrounding elite. "I am so incredibly relieved you decided to be reasonable and join us tonight to celebrate our family." She reached beneath the pristine white tablecloth and produced the thick, blue-backed legal document. She slid it squarely across the table, stopping it right in front of me. It was the post-nuptial agreement and the absolute custody surrender. She pulled a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from her clutch and placed it deliberately on top of the signature page. The trap was perfectly set. She had orchestrated this exact, highly public moment to maximize my humiliation, expecting the sheer crushing weight of social pressure to force my hand. She expected me to quietly, tearfully sign away my financial future and hand over my only son, while the cameras flashed and the Atlanta elite watched me break. Derek stood directly behind my chair, his hand pressing heavily and threateningly into my bare shoulder, a physical warning to comply. "Sign it, Brianna," he whispered directly into my ear, a dark, victorious gloat vibrating in his voice. "Do it right now." I stood completely still, looking down at the gold pen resting on the surrender documents. I felt the eyes of hundreds of people burning into my back. Patricia leaned forward, her wicked smile widening, waiting for my quiet, crushing submission. I did not touch the gold pen. I did not shed a single tear. I did not tremble under the crushing weight of the Atlanta elite's collective gaze. Instead, I reached up and firmly wrapped my fingers around Derek's wrist, lifting his heavy, oppressive hand entirely off my bare shoulder. I dropped his arm as if it were a diseased, rotting thing. Derek gasped, stumbling back half a step in sheer shock. Patricia's wicked, triumphant smile faltered instantly, her perfectly sculpted brow furrowing in genuine, undisguised confusion. She opened her mouth to issue a sharp reprimand to force me back into my designated box of submission, but I did not give her the chance. I picked up my heavy black leather satchel from the floor, turned my back on the VIP table, and began walking. I did not rush. I moved with deliberate, unhurried grace. The razor-sharp crimson silk of my gown swept across the polished marble floor, parting the sea of tuxedoed men and diamond-draped women. I walked directly toward the main stage at the front of the ballroom. The stage was elevated, adorned with cascading white floral arrangements, and occupied by a polished professional auctioneer preparing to commence the evening's charity bidding. He looked up, bewildered by my approach, and instinctively stepped back as I ascended the 4 carpeted steps. I reached out and casually took the microphone directly from his grip. A sharp, high-pitched whine of feedback pierced the air for a fraction of a second. It acted like a gunshot. The ambient noise of the gala died instantly. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased. The low, buzzing hum of hundreds of privileged conversations evaporated. Even the soft jazz ensemble playing in the far corner stopped mid-note. The room fell dead silent. The silence was absolute, thick, and suffocating. Hundreds of faces turned upward, their expressions morphing from polite, detached curiosity to absolute, paralyzed shock. I stood at the very edge of the stage, the bright, blinding spotlight hitting my face. I looked directly down at the VIP table. Patricia was half standing now, her face drained of all color, her emerald velvet dress suddenly looking like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Derek was frozen at the base of the dais, his mouth slightly open, his whiskey glass halted halfway to his lips. My mother-in-law loves to tell people I am terrible with money. My voice echoed through the cavernous ballroom, crisp, clear, and perfectly steady. The amplified sound bounced off the towering crystal chandeliers, ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. She enjoys reminding her country club peers that I lack the proper pedigree, that I am a financial liability, and that I require strict, unforgiving management. But thanks to her, I have just completed a very expensive masterclass in high finance. A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. I made deliberate eye contact with the city's mayor, then the chief of police, and finally the president of the local commercial bank. A man I knew personally funded many of Patricia's massive real estate ventures. For the past several days, I have received a rigorous, intensive crash course in the intricate art of corporate deception. I continued pacing slowly across the front of the stage, commanding the physical space like a seasoned prosecutor, delivering an opening statement. I have learned the precise exact mechanisms required to forge Delaware corporate registries. I have been educated on the highly specific routing codes necessary to funnel stolen marital assets directly into offshore blind trusts. I have even mastered the highly illegal, incredibly brazen art of cross-collateralizing commercial properties, using a stolen social security number to artificially inflate assets for fraudulent loans. The word fraudulent landed like a physical blow in the center of the room. The wealthy bankers and real estate tycoons sitting near the front stiffened their postures, turning rigid with sudden legal panic. Patricia slammed her hands flat onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Turn off the microphone!" she shrieked, her carefully cultivated high society persona shattering into a million jagged, hysterical pieces. "Security, remove her immediately. She is having a psychological breakdown. Get her off that stage." But no one moved. The security guard standing by the heavy oak exit doors hesitated, looking nervously between Patricia and the stage, paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying authority radiating from my posture. The guests were completely immobilized, utterly captivated by the spectacular unfolding disaster taking place in front of them. This was high society bloodsport, and they were entirely mesmerized. Derek finally snapped out of his paralyzed, slack-jawed stupor. He lunged forward, sprinting toward the stage stairs, his face contorted with dark, violent rage. "Brianna, shut your mouth!" he roared, attempting to use his physical intimidation to silence me. And from my husband, I projected my voice over his shouting, ensuring every single syllable hit the back wall of the ballroom with lethal precision. I learned how to seamlessly divert corporate bonuses directly into a $3 million luxury penthouse registered under a mistress's name, all while simultaneously draining a joint checking account and attempting to leave the mother of his child penniless and homeless. Derek stopped dead at the base of the stairs. The aggressive, domineering facade he wore so proudly crumbled into dust. The blood completely drained from his face as the highly specific, incredibly damaging details of his personal and financial betrayal were broadcast loudly to his bosses, his corporate peers, and his entire social circle. The whispers in the room erupted into a deafening, chaotic murmur. The carefully constructed illusion of the untouchable perfect family was burning to the ground right in front of their elite audience. Patricia clutched her chest, struggling to breathe, her eyes darting wildly around the room as she realized her peers were no longer looking at her with respect, but with profound, horrified suspicion. I reached into my black leather satchel. The leather was smooth and cool against my fingertips. I pulled out the 3 thick premium leather binders containing the meticulously assembled federal dossier. They were heavy, substantial, and packed with inescapable, ruinous evidence. I held the first binder up, allowing the gold-embossed lettering to catch the bright overhead spotlight. I stared down at the woman who had tried to erase my existence. I had the stage, I had the evidence, and I had the audience. The execution had just begun. I flipped open the thick leather cover of the first binder. The crisp, heavy crackle of the premium paper echoed through the microphone, magnified across the completely silent ballroom. I did not raise my voice to a shout. I maintained a chilling conversational volume that forced every single person in that massive space to hang on my every syllable. For example, I projected my gaze drilling directly into Patricia's wide, terrified eyes. I learned exactly how to use your daughter-in-law's social security number to secretly open 4 exclusive high-limit black cards. I studied the precise paperwork required to bypass standard verification protocols and secure $150,000 in fraudulent commercial loans. A collective sharp gasp ripped through the VIP tables. The wealthy bankers and real estate tycoons seated near the dais shifted abruptly, their faces twisted from polite curiosity into expressions of horrified professional liability. The men who had been toasting Patricia's business acumen just moments before were now staring at her as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. I shifted my stance on the elevated platform, angling the microphone toward the base of the stairs where Derek stood entirely paralyzed. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a finely sharpened blade. I learned how a husband can systematically and ruthlessly drain his own child's college savings account. I mapped the exact time-stamped wire transfers, demonstrating how my husband funneled our son's future directly into a luxury penthouse for his mistress, Monica Sterling. I pulled a thick stack of heavily redacted bank statements and a crisp color-printed copy of the property deed from the front pocket of the binder. I held them out over the edge of the stage and let them slip from my fingers. The pages fluttered down like grotesque snow, scattering across the polished marble floor right at Derek's feet. The bright white paper caught the overhead spotlights, serving as glaring, undeniable proof of his absolute moral bankruptcy. The heavy, suffocating silence of the ballroom shattered instantly. Total, unadulterated chaos erupted across the country club. The initial murmurs of shock violently escalated into a deafening roar of overlapping voices. Decades of meticulously curated social standing evaporated in a matter of seconds. The pristine veneer of high society fractured as pure human nature took over. Patricia turned a sickening ghost-white hue. The blood completely vanished from her face, leaving her heavily contoured cheeks looking skeletal under the brilliant crystal chandeliers. The carefully constructed facade of the gracious, powerful charity chairwoman dissolved into pure feral panic. She knocked her chair backward with tremendous force. The heavy carved wood crashed to the floor, but she did not even flinch. She lunged toward the stage. She scrambled up the velvet-covered stairs, her heavy emerald gown catching under her heels, causing her to stumble forward. She looked utterly deranged, a terrifying contrast to the regal host who had welcomed these guests an hour prior. She thrust her hands out like claws, attempting to physically tear the microphone from my grip. I easily took a step back, maintaining my dominant position on the stage, watching her flail wildly in her expensive dress. "She is insane!" Derek screamed, his voice cracking hysterically over the deafening uproar. He frantically waved his arms at the country club security guards, who were currently frozen in absolute confusion by the exit doors. "Turn off the sound system. Get her out of here right now. My wife is having a massive psychotic break." He dropped to his knees on the marble floor, frantically grabbing at the scattered bank statements and the penthouse deed. He desperately tried to crumple the glossy evidence, shoving the papers into his tuxedo jacket, but there were simply too many pages. His desperate crawling scramble only magnified his guilt to the audience looking down at him. His panicked shouting only fueled the spectacular public spectacle. The elite crowd did not look away in polite embarrassment. They leaned in eagerly. Across the massive ballroom, hundreds of glowing screens suddenly illuminated the dim romantic lighting. Cell phones were raised high in the air, recording every single agonizing second of the implosion. City council members, local influencers, and competing real estate developers were actively capturing Patricia's desperate, undignified scramble on the stage and Derek's pathetic, frantic screaming on the floor. The society photographers originally hired by Patricia to document her philanthropic glory were now rapidly snapping photos of the scattered evidence and the ensuing meltdown. The bright, relentless flashes of their cameras illuminated Patricia's terrified, ghostly face in rapid succession. Patricia let out a guttural, animalistic shriek, finally reaching the top level of the stage. She swiped wildly at the microphone stand, missing me entirely, and knocking over a massive, towering arrangement of imported white orchids. The heavy crystal vase shattered across the stage floor, sending water and crushed petals flying everywhere. She slipped on the wet surface, dropping to her hands and knees right in front of me. The wealthy attendees pushed closer to the dais, their murmurs turning into outright vocal accusations as the reality of my broadcasted words fully settled in. The financial backers who had previously smiled at Patricia were now actively retreating toward the exits, pulling out their own phones to alert their corporate legal departments before the fallout could stain their own reputations. I stood above the wreckage of their lives, the crimson silk of my gown untouched by the shattered glass and spilled water. The trap had sprung flawlessly. The devastation was absolute, permanent, and currently being broadcast live by hundreds of witnesses to the entire city. Patricia scrambled frantically on the wet marble, her heavy emerald gown soaking up the water from the shattered vase, completely oblivious to the hundreds of camera lenses documenting her disgrace. The elite crowd's collective gasp hung thickly in the air, a suspended moment of absolute shock. Then a new voice resonated through the cavernous ballroom. It was not shouting yet. It carried an undeniable lethal weight that commanded immediate silence. I believe my client has made her position perfectly clear. Jamal stepped out from the deep shadows near the grand sweeping staircase. He moved with the effortless predatory grace of a man who held all the winning cards. He was impeccably dressed in a custom midnight blue tuxedo with crisp satin lapels, looking less like a family law attorney and more like a high-stakes executioner. He did not rush. He navigated the sea of paralyzed socialites, taking the carpeted steps of the stage two at a time, coming to a halt directly beside me. He looked down at Patricia, who was still kneeling in the puddle of crushed orchids, offering absolutely no assistance. Jamal reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a pair of silver reading glasses, and slipped them on. He picked up the heavy microphone I had left resting on the podium, his voice booming with smooth, devastating authority. As the attorney representing the victims of Patricia's real estate fraud, I submitted this entire dossier to the FBI this morning. The acronym struck the room like a physical shockwave. The murmurs of the Atlanta elite instantly mutated into raw, unfiltered panic. The wealthy benefactors, the politicians, and the corporate tycoons who had spent the last decade accepting Patricia's lavish dinners and funding her ventures suddenly realized they were standing at ground zero of a massive federal crime scene. They began scrambling toward the exits, abandoning their champagne glasses on silver trays, shoving past one another in a desperate, undignified stampede to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. But nobody was leaving. Before the first panicked guest could even reach the heavy oak doors, the atmosphere in the country club violently shifted. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows lining the far wall of the ballroom, previously showcasing the manicured golf greens in the moonlight, were suddenly illuminated by harsh strobing flares. Intense blinding flashes of red and blue light sliced through the elegant darkness, casting long, frantic shadows against the crystal chandeliers. The heavy entrance doors swung open with a resounding, violent thud. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers, emblazoned with bold yellow lettering, flooded the grand lobby, flanked by local uniformed police officers. They moved with coordinated militaristic precision, a jarring and brutal contrast to the silk gowns and tailored tuxedos of the fleeing guests. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from granite, marched straight down the center aisle. He did not look at the fleeing socialites or the scattered evidence on the floor. His eyes were locked directly on the VIP dais. Patricia hauled herself to her feet, her ruined velvet dress clinging to her legs, her flawless makeup running down her face in dark, jagged streaks. She threw her shoulders back in a pathetic final attempt to summon her old authority. She pointed a trembling finger at the approaching agents, demanding they stop loudly invoking the names of city judges and state senators she falsely believed could still protect her. The lead agent remained entirely stone-faced. He bypassed Derek, entirely stepped onto the raised platform, and grabbed Patricia's arm with an iron grip. He spun her around, forcing her wrists behind her back. The cold, sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly over the din of the panicked crowd. It was the ultimate, inescapable humiliation. The untouchable queen of Atlanta society, the chairwoman of the board, physically restrained and read her Miranda rights in the exact center of her own glittering kingdom. Derek watched his mother being hauled away by federal authorities, completely immobilized by terror. The reality of his own deep complicity crashed into him like a freight train. He realized in real time that the protective shield of generational wealth had just evaporated. He was completely exposed, entirely bankrupt, and staring down the barrel of severe accessory charges. The arrogant smirk he had worn just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by raw, suffocating panic. He began hyperventilating. Great gasping breaths tore through his chest as the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. Sweat beaded across his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He looked frantically at the flashing police lights, then at his mother being marched out the double doors, and finally his wild, desperate eyes locked onto me. He scrambled away from the VIP table and stumbled toward the stage, his legs barely supporting his weight. He stopped right at my feet, looking up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated begging. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately clawing for a lifeline that no longer existed. He grabbed my fingers, his palms slick with cold sweat. "Brianna, please!" He gasped, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it is a mistake. I am your husband. I am Leo's father. We can fix this. I will fire my lawyers. I will give you whatever you want. Please, Brianna, give me a second chance. I love you." His pathetic groveling was a stark, nauseating contrast to the man who had gleefully threatened to leave me homeless and penniless just days prior. I did not pull my hand away immediately. I stood perfectly still in my crimson gown, letting him feel the cold, hard, terrifying reality of my absolute lack of emotion. I looked down at him, registering every ounce of his miserable, collapsing ego. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt nothing but the clean, sharp edge of total victory. I slowly pulled my fingers from his desperate grip, wiping my hand against the side of my silk dress, as if removing a stain. I stared him down, my voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried perfectly to his ears over the surrounding chaos. "Call an Uber. My car, my house, my son, I'm taking it all back." I turned my back on him. I stepped off the stage, Jamal walking closely at my side, and walked out the front doors of the country club, leaving Derek shivering on the marble floor in the total ruins of his family's legacy. The crisp night air felt entirely different as I descended the marble steps of the country club. It tasted like absolute, unadulterated freedom. Jamal walked beside me in comfortable silence, the distant wail of police sirens fading as we climbed into his waiting town car. The grand implosion of the Atlanta elite was behind me. Ahead lay the final systematic dismantling of my marriage. Fast forward exactly 3 months. The criminal justice system was already grinding Patricia into fine dust, but family court was where I was scheduled to personally finish Derek. The Fulton County Courthouse was a cold, sterile, brightly lit fortress of mahogany and beige linoleum. It was a severe contrast to the gold-draped ballroom where Derek's world had ended, but it was the perfect arena for a legal slaughter. I sat at the petitioner's table next to Jamal. I wore a tailored slate gray suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek, professional knot. Across the aisle sat Derek. He was a hollow, trembling shell of the arrogant corporate titan I had once married. His bespoke suit hung loosely on his diminished frame. The manicured hubris was gone, replaced by dark, sunken circles under his eyes and a nervous, constant twitch in his jaw. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense veteran with 30 years on the bench, peered over his wire-rimmed glasses with thinly veiled disgust. Derek's defense attorney, a sweaty, overworked man billing by the hour, attempted a pathetic opening statement. He tried to paint Derek as a flawed but deeply devoted father who simply wanted joint custody to remain a fixture in his son's life. He argued that Derek's mistakes were strictly financial, not parental, and that severing the paternal bond would be detrimental to a young boy. Jamal did not even wait for the man to sit down before unleashing hell. Jamal stood up, smoothed his jacket, and began projecting a digital footprint so comprehensive it left the entire courtroom breathless. He did not rely on emotional appeals. He used cold, hard data. He handed the judge a heavily bound dossier detailing the offshore accounts, the forged Delaware registries, and the precise IP tracked wire transfers. Jamal laid out the exact timestamps proving Derek had deliberately drained Leo's college fund while actively sitting in the same room as our son, funneling the cash to finance a penthouse for his mistress. Jamal then submitted the official unsealed FBI indictments. The federal charges outlined Patricia's massive real estate fraud and explicitly named Derek as a key active co-conspirator who had facilitated the entire laundering process. The judge flipped through the thick stack of irrefutable evidence. His face hardened into a mask of pure judicial wrath. He slammed the file onto his desk, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. He glared down at Derek with absolute contempt. The ruling was swift, brutal, and completely uncompromising. Derek was officially stripped of all physical and legal custody rights. He was deemed a profound moral hazard, a proven manipulator, and a severe flight risk given his ties to offshore banking. The judge granted him only strictly supervised visitation. He was allotted exactly 2 hours a week, alternating Sundays. These visits were to be conducted strictly inside a bleak, highly secure, court-approved municipal facility. A mandated off-duty police officer would monitor every single interaction, and Derek was ordered to pay the exorbitant hourly rate for the privilege. Derek physically shrank into his chair, a strangled, pathetic sob escaping his throat as the reality set in. He had entirely lost his son. But Jamal was far from finished. The custody ruling was merely the appetizer. The financial restitution was the main course. We moved directly into the division of marital assets. Derek's attorney weakly attempted to argue that the $45,000 drained from our joint checking account had been utilized for legitimate living expenses and marital debt consolidation. Jamal immediately countered by projecting the luxury real estate closing documents bearing Monica's signature funded directly and unequivocally by the stolen cash. The judge did not hesitate. He ordered Derek to completely liquidate his remaining personal assets within 30 days to repay the stolen funds in full. Derek was legally mandated to sell his imported sports cars, his vintage watch collection, his custom golf clubs, and his exclusive country club shares. Every single status symbol he had used to mask his profound insecurity was to be publicly auctioned off to make me whole. Then Jamal brought forward the absolute worst of their crimes. He presented the detailed, verified documentation of the identity theft. He displayed the 4 high-limit black cards Patricia and Derek had fraudulently opened using my social security number, alongside the $150,000 in illicit commercial loans taken out in my name. The judge's patience officially evaporated. He delivered a scathing, blistering reprimand from the bench stating for the public record that Derek's actions were a masterclass in financial and emotional abuse. To rectify the brazen identity theft, the intentionally ruined credit, and the severe calculated emotional distress inflicted upon me, the judge bypassed standard asset division entirely. He awarded me massive, unprecedented punitive damages. The final judgment figure was astronomical. It was a crushing, insurmountable mountain of debt that immediately and completely bankrupted my abusers. Derek sat completely paralyzed, his hands shaking violently on the wooden table. His mother's vast real estate empire was currently frozen by federal authorities. His lucrative corporate career was permanently obliterated. His son was legally shielded from his influence. And now he owed me everything he would ever earn for the rest of his miserable life. I stood up from the table, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely blank. I packed my files into my black leather satchel, turned on my heel, and walked out of the courtroom. I left Derek sitting in the deafening silence, drowning in the absolute ruin he had built with his own 2 hands. The heavy oak doors of the Fulton County Courthouse shut solidly behind me, sealing Derek inside his newly constructed tomb. I stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun, the heavy black leather satchel resting securely against my hip. The air smelled of exhaust and hot pavement, But to me, it was the sweetest, most intoxicating scent I had ever experienced. The war was officially over and the cleanup operation had begun. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding inevitability, but when it finally strikes, it crushes everything in its path. Patricia's reckoning arrived just 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Her highly publicized trial became the ultimate spectacle for the very same Atlanta elite she had spent decades attempting to dominate. I sat in the back row of the federal courtroom watching as the undisputed queen of the country club was led to the defense table. She was stripped of her tailored emerald velvet and suffocating diamond necklaces forced instead into a drab, shapeless khaki jumpsuit. The transformation was startling. Without her expensive armor and the intimidating glare of stolen wealth, she looked incredibly small, frail, and utterly ordinary. The federal judge possessed no patience for her high society theatrics or her attorney's desperate pleas for leniency based on her age and supposed philanthropic contributions. The evidence was an insurmountable mountain of deception. The prosecution laid out the full staggering extent of her corporate malfeasance, detailing the extensive identity theft, the deliberate tax evasion, and the millions funneled through offshore accounts. The judge delivered the sentence with a cold, unwavering finality. Patricia was sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. There would be no comfortable, white-collar minimum security resort for her. She was heading to a harsh, unforgiving federal prison. I watched the bailiff secure the heavy metal cuffs around her wrists, the clinking sound echoing the exact moment her empire officially collapsed. The prison sentence was only the physical punishment. The financial devastation administered by the Internal Revenue Service was the ultimate fatal blow to her legacy. To recover the massive, staggering sums owed in back taxes, accumulated fraud penalties, and the restitution mandated by the federal courts, the IRS moved with ruthless efficiency. They systematically dismantled her life's work piece by piece. The crown jewel of her stolen empire, the sprawling, opulent estate where she had hosted her lavish charity galas, was formally seized. Federal agents descended on the property, unceremoniously changing the locks on the heavy mahogany doors and securing large, bright red seizure notices to the towering iron gates. The imported white orchids withered, the manicured lawns overgrew, the massive crystal chandeliers were powered down for the final time. The estate was scheduled for public auction to satisfy her immense debts to the government. The ultimate humiliation for a woman obsessed with appearances was the reality that her most prized possession, the physical manifestation of her perceived superiority, was ripped away and sold to the highest bidder. Her name was completely erased from Atlanta high society, transforming overnight from a symbol of power into a cautionary tale of greed. While Patricia was stripped of her freedom, Derek was methodically stripped of his identity. The fallout from the FBI indictments and the highly publicized civil judgments rendered him completely radioactive in the corporate sector. The board of directors at his firm did not hesitate. The morning after the federal charges were unsealed, Derek was summoned to the executive suite and unceremoniously fired. He was stripped of his lucrative corporate director title, his generous stock options were frozen, and his company access was immediately revoked. The man who had prided himself on controlling rooms and intimidating subordinates was escorted out of the glass tower by 2 silent security guards carrying nothing but a small cardboard box containing his desk accessories. He attempted to reach out to his vast network of influential peers, making desperate phone calls to secure a consulting position or a quiet executive role at a competing firm. He found nothing but dead air. His reputation was entirely decimated. He was blacklisted, viewed as a massive legal and public relations liability that no reputable company would dare touch. The complete loss of his income collided violently with the crushing weight of his court-ordered debts. The massive punitive damages awarded to me combined with the mandated restitution for the stolen $45,000 instantly bankrupted him. The courts forcibly liquidated his remaining assets. His imported sports cars were repossessed. His expensive country club memberships were revoked. He was left with absolutely nothing but a staggering negative net worth and a tarnished name. With the money completely gone, the carefully constructed illusion of his glamorous new life shattered. Monica, the mistress, who had eagerly accepted the keys to the $3 million penthouse, possessed no loyalty to a disgraced, unemployed man drowning in debt. The moment the federal authorities seized the penthouse as an illicitly purchased asset, Monica packed her extensive collection of designer bags and vanished. She did not leave a forwarding address. She did not offer a tearful goodbye. She simply abandoned him the very second the cash flow ceased, proving that his perceived value to her was entirely tied to the stolen funds he could provide. Derek was left completely, utterly alone. With his assets liquidated and his credit score completely destroyed by the massive judgments his housing options evaporated, he was forced to move to the far industrial outskirts of the city, signing a lease on a tiny, run-down studio apartment. The space was a grim, claustrophobic box located above a noisy commercial laundromat. The walls featured peeling yellowed paint, and the single window offered a depressing view of a cracked asphalt parking lot. A rusted, leaking faucet dripped constantly into a stained porcelain sink, providing a steady, maddening rhythm to his isolation. There were no vaulted ceilings, no sweeping staircases, and no tailored suits. Derek spent his days sitting on a cheap, sagging mattress, staring at the cracked walls, finally forced to exist in the bleak, miserable reality he had so arrogantly tried to force upon me. He had traded his family, his career, and his future for a fleeting illusion of power, and now he had the rest of his life to sit in that cramped, suffocating room and calculate the exact devastating cost of his betrayal. I did not waste a single second thinking about Derek rotting in his studio above the commercial laundromat. He belonged to the past, a closed chapter gathering dust in a discarded book. My focus was entirely fixed on the horizon. The massive punitive damages and the recovered funds hit my newly established private accounts with a heavy digital finality. It was an unprecedented amount of capital, more than enough to ensure absolute security for Leo and myself. But I had no intention of simply hoarding the wealth or letting it sit idle in an investment portfolio. I was a creator at heart. I took that settlement money forged in the brutal fires of my own survival and decided to build something spectacular. I secured a sprawling, sun-drenched loft in the heart of Atlanta's West Midtown Design District. It was a massive industrial space featuring original exposed brick, flawlessly polished concrete floors, and enormous floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the open-concept rooms with brilliant natural light. This beautiful, airy fortress became the headquarters for my new venture. I launched an elite premium UX/UI design agency. We were not just building basic websites or standard applications. We were architecting seamless, cutting-edge digital experiences for top-tier tech firms, international e-commerce platforms, and global lifestyle brands. I poured my expertise, my relentless drive, and my newfound capital into acquiring state-of-the-art equipment, ergonomic workstations, and the absolute best software suites available on the market. However, the physical space and the high-end technology were only the outer shell of my vision. The true revolution was the internal culture I deliberately cultivated inside those walls. Having barely survived a world of generational wealth that viewed women, particularly mothers, as liabilities and accessories, I constructed my agency to be the exact diametric opposite. I completely discarded the rigid, suffocating corporate blueprints that demanded senseless face time and penalized human lives. Instead, I designed a hiring protocol specifically targeting the brilliant minds that traditional corporate gatekeepers routinely ignored. My first round of hires consisted almost entirely of single mothers and marginalized creatives. I sought out the fiercely talented women who possessed gaps in their resumes due to caregiving responsibilities. I hired the brilliant self-taught designers who lacked expensive Ivy League degrees but demonstrated raw, undeniable talent. I knew intimately the fierce, unparalleled work ethic of a woman fighting to provide a better life for her child. I wanted that exact energy, that hunger, and that drive powering my company. To support my extraordinary team, I instituted radical, uncompromising policies. I utilized a large section of our loft to build a fully staffed premium on-site childcare center right next to the main design floor. I mandated flexible working hours, remote options without penalty, and comprehensive healthcare packages that covered everything from premium pediatric care to fully funded mental health services. I eliminated the toxic competitive backstabbing that plagued most agencies. The agency operated on a firm foundation of absolute empathy, transparent communication, and unyielding empowerment. The result of this radical culture was instantaneous and explosive. Surrounded by a fiercely loyal, highly motivated team who finally felt seen and valued, our creative output was staggering. We were pitching and winning massive, highly lucrative contracts against established legacy firms. My team delivered innovative interfaces and brilliant user experiences that disrupted industry standards and left our clients absolutely speechless. We were rapidly becoming the most sought-after design firm in the Southeast. As the agency scaled at a breathtaking pace, the legal complexities of our operations grew exponentially. We were securing massive corporate contracts, navigating intricate webs of intellectual property rights, and dealing with aggressive corporate giants who often tried to bully smaller agencies. I needed someone sharp, ruthless, and entirely trustworthy to oversee our legal affairs. I needed a shark to protect my creatives. There was only one person on Earth who fit that exact description. I called Jamal. He arrived at the Midtown loft on a bustling Tuesday afternoon. He stepped out of the elevator looking as impeccably tailored and deeply intimidating as ever. I watched him take in the vibrant, thriving ecosystem I had built. He observed the focused designers collaborating at glass tables, admired the sleek digital mock-ups projected on the walls, and smiled as the sound of children laughing drifted over from the adjacent childcare center. I invited him into my glass-walled office overlooking the city skyline. I did not offer him a simple job. I offered him a stake in a growing empire. I asked Jamal to leave his prestigious family law firm and join my agency full-time as our dedicated corporate counsel and executive partner. I needed his lethal precision to lock down our contracts and ensure my team was never exploited. Jamal sat back in the leather chair, steepled his fingers, and smiled his signature predatory smile. He accepted the offer immediately. Jamal stepping into the role of corporate counsel solidified our entire operation. He brought his terrifying legal brilliance to the corporate arena. He decimated unfair client contracts, negotiated unprecedented retainer fees for our agency, and ensured our intellectual property was locked down in ironclad legal vaults. No corporation dared to push back against our terms when Jamal was sitting on the other side of the negotiating table. We formed a highly successful, unbreakable family business alliance. It was a partnership forged in the dark trenches of a brutal divorce and cemented by a mutual, unwavering commitment to justice, equity, and absolute respect. We trusted each other implicitly. I handled the creative vision and the corporate culture, while Jamal served as the impenetrable shield guarding our perimeter. Together we built an agency that not only generated massive wealth, but also actively changed the lives of everyone who worked for us. We were completely unstoppable, rising from the ashes of our pasts to conquer the future. That future materialized perfectly on a beautifully crisp Thursday afternoon. The heavy, suffocating humidity of the Atlanta summer had finally broken, leaving behind a sharp, clean autumn chill that carried the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke. The sky was an unbroken expanse of brilliant, blinding blue. I was walking down the exact same stretch of pavement in the exclusive Buckhead enclave where I had been discarded months prior. I traced the precise path where I had once stumbled in the freezing rain. I recognized the specific iron gate I had leaned against for support, and I clearly saw the jagged crack in the concrete where my designer heel had snapped, leaving me bleeding and shivering in the dark. The ghosts of that humiliating night lingered on this street, but they no longer possessed any power to haunt me. I was not limping today. I wore flat, comfortable leather boots and a thick cashmere coat, stepping over that same crack in the concrete with absolute, unshakable stability. Little Leo was happily walking right beside me. His small, warm hand was wrapped tightly around my fingers. He wore a bright yellow jacket, skipping over piles of fallen oak leaves and laughing as they crunched loudly beneath his sneakers. He was completely oblivious to the trauma that had occurred on this very sidewalk. He knew absolutely nothing of the shattered vases, the federal agents, or the cold linoleum of the family courtroom. His world was entirely safe, entirely secure, and completely shielded from the radioactive fallout of the Blackwell family legacy. Watching his carefree, bouncing steps filled my chest with a profound, overwhelming warmth. I squeezed his hand and he beamed up at me, his eyes bright and completely unburdened. We reached the corner of the avenue, standing under the sprawling branches of a massive elm tree. Right on schedule, the deep, resonant purr of a powerful engine broke the quiet ambiance of the neighborhood. I looked up, expecting to see the familiar rusted grille of the battered pickup truck that had served as my emergency rescue vehicle on the worst night of my life. Instead, a gleaming gunmetal gray luxury SUV glided around the corner and pulled to a seamless, silent stop directly in front of us. The vehicle was a masterpiece of modern engineering, boasting aggressively sleek lines, pristine tinted windows, and a flawless mirror-like finish that reflected the autumn foliage. The heavy driver's side door swung open and Thomas stepped out onto the curb. He was not wearing his usual grease-stained work shirt. He wore a crisp, tailored jacket, looking every bit the successful operations manager he had become. A massive, genuine grin split his face as he walked around the front of the imposing vehicle. He did not offer me a ride in a borrowed passenger seat today. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy silver key fob, and tossed it through the crisp air. I caught it effortlessly in my free hand. The metal was cool and solid against my palm. "I made the dealership detail the interior twice," Thomas said, crossing his arms over his chest and nodding approvingly at the gleaming exterior. "The paperwork is finalized, the registration is completely cleared, and the title is sitting in the glove box, paid in full. She is entirely yours." She is entirely. There was no hidden financing, no conditional lease agreement, and no strings tied to a manipulative mother-in-law. The vehicle belonged exclusively to me. It was a tangible, heavy fortress of my own making, purchased outright with the capital I had secured through my own survival. I looked at Thomas, registering the immense distance we had covered since he found me shivering on the side of this road. I offered him a nod of profound, unspoken gratitude. He winked, patted the sleek hood of the car, and began walking down the avenue toward the nearby transit station, leaving me standing alone with my son and my brand-new machine. I unlocked the SUV. The heavy doors unsealed with a satisfying, highly engineered click. I opened the rear passenger door and lifted Leo inside. The cabin smelled strongly of rich, untouched leather and pristine factory components. I carefully buckled him into his premium safety seat, ensuring the straps were perfectly snug across his chest. He immediately began playing with the buttons on his bright yellow jacket, humming a quiet, happy tune. I closed the rear door with a solid, echoing thud. I walked around the back of the vehicle, the crisp wind whipping my hair across my face, and pulled open the driver's door. I slid into the premium leather seat. The cabin was an immaculate, silent sanctuary, completely isolating me from the noise of the outside world. I gripped the thick, heated steering wheel, feeling the smooth stitching beneath my fingers. I reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror. I locked eyes with my own reflection. I studied the sharp, clear lines of my face. The terrified, exhausted woman who had frantically scrambled across a wet marble floor was entirely gone. The anxious wife who constantly monitored her husband's volatile moods had been completely eradicated. The eyes looking back at me were calm, lethal, and brilliantly clear. I saw a fiercely independent CEO, a fiercely protective mother, and an undeniable survivor. I sat back against the headrest, letting the absolute silence of the luxury cabin wash over me. My mind drifted back to the chaotic, terrifying seconds when Patricia had physically ripped the car keys out of my trembling hands. I remembered the sheer, suffocating panic of watching her taillights disappear into the rain, leaving me stranded with absolutely nothing. At the time, it had felt like a brutal, devastating tragedy. It felt like the violent end of my entire existence. Looking at my calm reflection in the mirror, the ultimate undeniable truth finally clicked into place. Patricia had not destroyed me that night. When she forcefully tore those keys from my grasp, she was unknowingly severing the heavy rusted anchor that had kept me drowning in their toxic harbor. She thought she was leaving me paralyzed, but she was actually clearing the path. That horrific moment of abandonment was not a tragedy at all. It was the exact necessary catalyst for my liberation. It was the precise moment I was finally forcefully compelled to take the wheel of my own life. I smiled. It was a small, sharp, deeply satisfied smile. I pressed my foot firmly against the brake pedal and pushed the ignition button. The massive engine roared to life beneath me, vibrating with immense controlled power. I shifted the vehicle into drive, checked my blind spot, and pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the Buckhead pavement completely behind me. The most profound lesson from Brianna's journey is that rock bottom is often the strongest foundation for rebuilding. When her abusers stripped away her false security, it felt like a devastating tragedy. However, that absolute abandonment was the exact catalyst she needed to stop relying on a toxic environment. It empowered her to take the wheel, trust her resilience, and forge an empire rooted in authentic values. True security never comes from external validation. It is built from within, when you reclaim your independence. Share your story of turning a major setback into your greatest comeback in the comments below.